Okay, this is section 3 of chapter 17. The last section looked at humanistic and psychodynamic psychoanalytic therapies. Now we're going to look at cognitive and behavior therapies. And if you look at that opening story about Brooks Workman and what she visualized, what it was she was doing, I'm going to have you read through that and figure it out for yourself. One of the questions I'm going to expect you to answer is, why was she doing it? What was the point? This was a form of behavior modification, as described in the definition on page 499, a systematic method of changing the way a person acts and feels. This is fundamental in particular to behavior therapies, and we're going to go ahead and jump around a bit. So I want you to skip ahead to behavior therapies on page 502, where behavior therapy is defined as an emphasis on changing undesirable behaviors, and they didn't put this in here, promoting desired behaviors through conditioning techniques. Now, one of the most common ways of conditioning involve counter-conditioning. Okay, this is a means by which you engage in a form of behavior therapy, behavior modification, to try and counter some form of behavior that you no longer wish to do, or to counter some type of behavior that you find counterproductive. I'll give you a hint about that question about Brooks Workman. She was engaged in counter-conditioning. What exactly, my question is, what exactly was she counter-conditioning? Systematic desensitization is another example of this sort of counter-conditioning, where you work to counter someone's phobia, for instance, of spiders, or perhaps dogs, as is illustrated on page 503. Someone has a great fear of some type of thing, and you systematically, slowly expose them more and more to what had been an aversive stimulus. And when you do it often enough and the aversive stimulus doesn't hurt you, you eventually come to realize it's not really that aversive, and it becomes an okay thing to do. I'm not going to go through this in extensive ways today, because we've actually gone through it multiple times. So that's counter-conditioning, is systematic desensitization. There's another form of counter-conditioning known as aversion training, or aversive conditioning. And you could argue that Brooks is doing that sort of thing, but typically when you're talking about genuine aversive conditioning, you're talking about something a little more direct. Have you ever seen those shock collars that they have on dogs? They're using aversive conditioning there. I had a friend in Wyoming years and years ago. He was actually my clinical supervisor. Would have been in the late 80s. At any rate, he had a Springer Spaniel. Hunter? No. Well, some sort of Spaniel. Spaniels are very lively dogs. And he had a shock collar on him. And he was trying to train his dog in such a way so that he could leave him out in the front yard with no fence. And then the dog would know that he wasn't to leave the yard. And what would happen is he'd go ahead and put the dog on the porch, and knowing Spaniels, they immediately rocket off. The minute the dog got off the yard, my friend would start shocking him. And eventually the dog knew that if he was out of the yard and getting shocked, he needed to return to the yard. Well, eventually he was getting shocked just by setting foot on the curb. And eventually that dog, you could let him out without the shock collar, and he knew to stay in the yard, because he was conditioned to understand that if he went outside the lawn in particular, he was going to get shocked. Another example of this sort of thing is to give a longtime alcoholic a chemical known as antabuse. Now, antabuse, I don't know exactly what antabuse is made of. I just know that it is a chemical compound that you can consume, and normally it has no impact on you whatsoever. It's completely inert, absolutely harmless. The problem is that when it gets mixed with ethanol, which is the alcohol that you find in drinks, when it gets mixed with ethanol, it causes unbelievable nausea. I mean, the person gets violently ill. So the idea is that if a dedicated alcoholic is really having trouble stopping the drink in an extreme circumstance, have them take antabuse so that it is continually in their system, so that when they're tempted to drink, they will suddenly then throw up. And remember that concept of one-trial learning? You're trying to associate nausea with the feeling of alcohol. That's the idea. Oddly enough, this doesn't work super well, because dedicated drunks, do they throw up a lot? Yeah. So they're kind of familiar with it. So antabuse has varying levels of success. Okay, so that's counter-conditioning. But then you can also use operant conditioning, which we've talked about numerous times. When we talk about a token economy, remember I worked with those kids who were emotionally disturbed adolescents, and they were not accustomed to following the rules, and they were in a residential treatment facility where they had things they had to do every day. They had to keep their room clean, they had to go to class, they had to get their homework done, they had to do certain house chores, and if they did all these things, they would get these tokens, like poker chips. Now, poker chips in and of themselves have no actual value, but kids at every week could gather in their poker chips, and they could go to the store that we ran, and they could exchange chips for things they had in the store. And it could be anything from snacks to reading material to video games to, we had horses in the facility, and they could exchange it for an opportunity to spend time with the horses, or perhaps even go out for a ride. Similarly, if they misbehaved, they'd get chips taken away from them. Okay, the token economy is a form of operant conditioning, and as we've described in the past, we all live in a giant token economy because we exchange little pieces of paper that have no real intrinsic meaning till they die, or not the paper dies, till we die. We live in a token economy as well. Now, cognitive behavior therapy, this is the group that focuses on those cognitive disturbances. No, sorry, not disturbances, bad term. Cognitive disturbances is appropriate to schizophrenia. Cognitive distortions. Right, and this is similar to rational emotive therapy. If you go back to page 500, you see Albert Ellis formed a therapy called RET. It's this aimed at changing unrealistic assumptions about oneself and other people. In short, those cognitive distortions. But Ellis, what do you think? Do you think Ellis makes a good humanistic therapist? If you remember from the lecture in section 2, we're talking about humanistic therapies, where you have to have unconditional positive regard. The instant in Ellis's rational emotive therapy, anytime someone showed up with a manifestation of a cognitive distortion, like they had to be perfect, or they could never make mistakes, or they had to please everyone, the minute that sort of cognitive distortion would show up, Ellis would sit bolt upright in his chair and literally start yelling at the client, about how their thinking was wrong, they got to change their thinking. That's a distortion. Knock it off. Sound like good humanistic therapy? Not on your life. Will it sometimes be effective? Absolutely. Which then leads to Beck and his maladaptive thought patterns. This is part of cognitive therapy, bottom of page 501. You overgeneralize, making blanket judgments about oneself. I'm a failure. I failed the test, therefore I'm a failure. No, Beck would say, you failed the test. This doesn't mean you're an overall failure. Polarized thinking, categorizing information in two categories. Most people don't like me. Or people either like me or they hate me. Well, is this true? I mean, people are going to like some things about you and they're going to not like some things about you. That's part of humanity. And finally, selective attention, focusing on one detail in the face of many. People are always criticizing me. Well, okay, you do get criticized. Are you really going to tell me you're getting criticized all the time? Now, Beck and Ellis was RET. He's the one to jump up in his chair and start yelling at his patients. Beck would not yell, but he'd still confront. He'd say, look, you're engaging in an overgeneralization, or you're engaging in selective attention. You're focusing only on those negative things you want to focus on. You can't do that. So cognitive therapies aren't exactly something that mesh together necessarily super well with humanistic therapies. But if you use humanistic therapy to establish a strong relationship so that the client then trusts you, then you can start using cognitive or cognitive behavioral therapies or rational emotive therapies like Ellis's to actually gently confront the client and say, you know, that thinking, probably not the healthiest. When you're saying you have to please everyone, you are setting yourself up for failure. We've got to reorient the thinking. Okay, so that's cognitive therapies and behavior therapies in a nutshell. This next one is biological approaches to treatment, and while the section is not that terrifically long, I will have assigned it via Google Classroom. Read it carefully. I think this will lead to a slightly longer lecture the next time we get together. See ya.